Hello everyone. Welcome to a new video. The Secret of Seaview Cottage. Isn't it wonderful? Cried Jimmy Wright as he followed his comrades of the Kestrel Patrol into the tiny cottage standing a few yards from the deserted beach. I wonder if we shall find any treasure buried under the floorboards. Hey, cried Mr. Millman, the wealthy scoutmaster of the troop of Sea Scouts, letting your imagination run wild, Jimmy? The youngest member of the patrol went red. I was just wondering, sir, he said lamely. The scoutmaster patted the boy on the back. It will be dark soon, he said, and I'm sure you're all as hungry as I am after the voyage. Yes, sir, cried the scouts, and then began a general forage round for stores and cooking pots. An hour later the boys. And the scoutmaster gave vent to satisfied sighs and agreed that a meal had never gone down so well. Do you think this place is haunted, sir? Asked Jimmy after the meal had been cleared away and he listened to the creaking of the floorboards overhead. Mr. Millman nodded, a smile on his lips. It's local gossip, he answered, and I well remember that when my brother and I were lads we used to see all manner of weird shadows pass across the windows of Seaview Cottage. The speaker laughed, but don't you worry, he added, you won't meet any ghosts. The youngest scout grinned rather feebly and then, squaring his shoulders, glanced across at his best friend, Bob Willis. Hey, Bob, he cried, let's explore. And at the other's eager nod the two rose and vanished up the winding staircase of the old cottage to which Mr. Millman had brought some of his scouts in his small yacht for a month's holiday. Meanwhile the others continued to talk and Gerald Turnbull was in the middle of a rather funny story when there came a terrific clatter on the stairs and Bob Willis literally fell into the room. Help, he gasped. Gee ghosts, we've seen them. Don't be silly, snapped the scoutmaster, gripping the Sea Scout, you're not a kid. Bob swallowed hard and pulled himself together. I'm sorry. Sir, he answered bravely, but Jimmy and I saw a figure upstairs and... Where is Jimmy? Asked Jack Barton, suddenly. Bob shook his head. I don't know, he replied, I thought. He was behind me. Mr. Millman looked rather anxious. Come along, all of you, he said. This must be looked into. And he led the way upstairs, to find all the bedrooms deserted. Jimmy Wright had completely and utterly vanished. Suddenly there came a cry from the room over the kitchen and, as the others dashed back into the room where Bob had seen his supposed ghost, they found Jack Barton peering into a cupboard. Look, sir, cried Jack, as he held the door of the cupboard open for his scoutmaster. Isn't that a door or something at the back? Mr. Millman whipped out a torch and flashed its beam on the back of the cupboard. You're right, he muttered, and what's more it is partly open. There's no doubt that our young friend Jimmy has gone exploring further. Keep together all of you and follow me. There seem to be some steps leading downwards. The boys of the Kestrel Patrol followed eagerly, there. Hearts beating with excitement and hardly able to credit the fact that they were having a great adventure on the first day of their holiday, one by one they passed through the cupboard and then down a flight of dirty, worn and slippery stone steps. Once down the steps, the members of the patrol found that they were in a lofty, well-built tunnel. All had torches, for whoever heard of a scout who was not prepared for any emergency, so that these tiny points of light were quite enough to light up the tunnel. The procession moved forward in silence and without any incident, but, suddenly, the scoutmaster called a halt and, pushing and jostling, the boys managed to get close enough to their leader to see what had caused him to stop so abruptly. Here is the reason for the tunnel, whispered the owner of the yacht which, even then, rode safely at anchor in the bay. Here is evidence of what work Bob's ghost does for a living. Necks were craned forward and questions rose to every pair of lips. Do you mean that we've hit upon a smuggler's lair? Whispered Bob. That's about the size of it, agreed the scoutmaster, and I reckon there's something like 1,000 pounds worth of contraband goods here. Jove, whispered Jack Barton. What a thrill. Then he paused. But what about Jimmy? He went on. If there are smugglers about, even modern ones, won't he be running into terrible danger? The scoutmaster raised his head. By Jove, he said earnestly. You're dead right, Jack. We must push forward. At once, those men won't stop at anything to prevent their secret from being Mr. Millman stopped speaking. As abruptly as if someone had pressed pause, for a sudden shout echoed round the tunnel. "Quick!" yelled Gerald Turnbull. "I've found a treasure and a skeleton." In a second, the scoutmaster and the rest of the Kestrel patrol were dashing along the tunnel. Bob Willis was the first to arrive at his comrade's side, but the others were not far behind. Soon they were all staring with amazed eyes at a pile of tarnished gold and silver articles which were hidden in a deep recess in the wall, and at a bleached skeleton. "Jumping snakes!" cried Mr. Millman. "This is a find. This is why the tunnel was constructed. The smuggling part of the business must have come much later." He paused. "But how did the smugglers manage to miss it? I should have thought it would be impossible not to see this lot." "Oh. But sir," put in Gerald, "it was all hidden by a covering of plaster which was completely concealed by layers of dirt. It was by sheer accident that I fell heavily against the plaster." The scoutmaster nodded understandingly and, after examining the treasure and avoiding contact with the bones, he straightened up. "We can't bother about this now," he cried. "We've got Jimmy Wright to think about. Forward the Kestrel patrol, but make less noise. I think I can see the opening just ahead." And he leveled his torch towards the tunnel some yards away. "Shall we turn off our torches?" asked Bob. "A good idea," came the reply, and so, in the darkness of that underground tunnel, the members of the patrol of Sea Scouts crept along towards the entrance. It was a weird and solemn experience, and none of the boys were sorry when they finally emerged into the open air at a quiet spot amongst the sand dunes some 200 yards from the water's edge. "Now what?" whispered David Jones. "Shush," hissed the scoutmaster, warningly. "I thought I heard something." And the party stood stock still and listened intently. "There's someone close by," whispered Bob Willis in his leader's ear, "to the right, I think." The other nodded, and then bidding the remainder of the patrol stay where they were, he and Bob wriggled their way forward between the low shrub-like bushes. Bob was leading, and so it was that he was the first to discover his chum. "Jimmy," he cried as he stumbled over the form of the scout who had started the adventure. "Are you all right? Speak, Jimmy, for goodness sake, say something." "Uggle uggle wum," said Jimmy, obediently. "He's gagged," rapped out the scoutmaster as he bent over the prostrate figure of the youngest member of the Kestrels, and in less than a minute Jimmy Wright was gasping out his story, the gist of which was that he had chased a ghost through the tunnel only to meet with 3 other very solid ghosts on the beach. "They knocked me on the head," he finished ruefully, "tied that filthy rag round my mouth until I could hardly breathe, and then pinched the Seahawk. I heard them start the engine." Mr. Millman did not hesitate for a second, and, as there was no longer any need for silence, he placed a silver whistle to his lips and blew 3 short blasts, the call of the Kestrel patrol. In a very short while, the rest of the scouts came up at the double. "Man the outboard," commanded the scoutmaster, "and make for the yacht. You, Bob," he added, "signal the captain to up anchor. We're going after those smugglers. Unless he hesitated. Unless anyone would like to turn in," he finished. A chorus of protest went up, and a few minutes later the whole patrol was aboard the smaller of the yacht's 3 shorecraft. It was a tight squeeze, for the stolen Seahawk was much the bigger boat, but the Sea Scouts managed it and were soon making, without lights, for the yacht that had not yet steamed away after bringing the boys to the cottage. When they arrived alongside, they were greeted by Captain Strutt. "You're too late, sir," he called out, "and it's a good job I didn't sail on the evening tide. But I'll lower the gangway, sir," he added, "and tell the whole story." "Now what's all this about Cap N?" demanded the owner of the yacht as he finally stood on deck. "What do you mean by saying that we are too late?" The hardy old salt saluted and then grinned almost boyishly. "I mean just this, sir," he answered, and at a sign from him, 3 sailors came forward dragging between them 4 very sorry-looking specimens of humanity. "Were you looking for these gentlemen, sir?" he asked. Mr. Millman nodded. "We were," he answered, "and I'm mighty glad you saved us the trouble of chasing them." "Saw them making off with the Seahawk, sir," said the captain, "so me and the second mate tumbled into the longboat and napped 'em." The scoutmaster looked worried. "What shall we do with them?" he asked. "They probably belong to some village about here." The captain shook his head. "No, sir," he replied, "they're foreigners. And I reckon you gave them a complete surprise when you moved into the cottage. They've probably been doing a roaring trade in smuggled goods for ages." Mused the owner of the yacht. "Then we had better keep them below for tonight and hand them over to the police in the morning." And thus the secret, or rather the two secrets, of Seaview Cottage became revealed, and after a good deal of legal talk, the Sea Scouts received a goodly sum of money from the government as their share of the treasure trove. Then the big yacht was bought for the troop, for it must be mentioned that Mr. Millman had seriously considered selling it owing to the expense incurred in keeping it in commission, and the Scouts had one of the finest vessels of its kind around the coast of Great Britain, all because Jimmy Wright and Bob Willis went chasing ghosts. Oh, and by the way, Seaview Cottage is now known as Smuggler's Cottage and is the smartest little place one could ever wish to see. Writer Arthur Groom. Thank you. Hope you liked the video and do subscribe the channel for more videos.